So this is Dan of Vagabond Awake, and we're lucky today to have Jeff on the channel. Today, our guest, Jeff, is going to share four very important things if you're considering retiring overseas. Number one is that there's a Medicare supplement you can get if you're a U.S. citizen that will cover $50,000 of healthcare expenses when you're overseas. The second thing is he shares some tips on establishing a Florida domicile. That refers back to a video we did a couple weeks ago. The third thing is Jeff shares about some of his favorite hospitals, and I've had the same experiences of both hospital and dental in Southeast Asia. If you open an account overseas and you're a U.S. citizen, there's a foreign account reporting requirements that you should learn about. Okay, let's get going. About a week ago, I did an interview with a gentleman who explained about how a service he was using to his residents moved from Hawaii to Florida. And Jeff, our guest today, sent an email saying that not all states are the same. Some are more aggressive than others, so you need to be careful. And as with all things like this on my channel that we discuss, we're just raising issues. Jeff and I are not qualified to talk about tax law. We're raising an issue so you can talk to your lawyer intelligently about what your fears are. So Jeff, tell us what you learned about it, and help people understand maybe what they're up against so they know what to ask their lawyer.
Well, the fellow you were interviewing had come from Hawaii, and he was talking about that he had changed his residency to Florida because his parents were still in Florida. And he briefly mentioned the very well-known case of the people in California who had moved offshore for 10 years, and they were U.S. citizens. So they dutifully continued to file their 1040s every year. But of course, since they weren't in California anymore, they didn't file their California return. And then for whatever reason, be it family or health, they returned after about 10 years to California and became residents again. And California came after them and said, hey, you haven't been filing your California returns. They said, well, we haven't been living here. California said, that doesn't matter. You were residents when you left. You were residents while you were away, and you're residents now. And they took this all the way up, not to the Supreme Court, but the one just below it. And I believe the Supreme Court declined to hear it, or that I'm not qualified to state. But they went all the way up in terms of legal challenges and lost. So the state bankrupted them because not only did they have to pay all the income taxes, but they were charged penalties and interest as well as their legal fees. So it was quite financially devastating. And on a further note to that, because I was a New York resident, and that's the second most aggressive state, in the guide that I followed, they talk about this couple who retired to Florida and kept their New York residences, but they thought they became Florida residents, and they had a similar thing where New York State came after them and said, you're still New York residents and you have to continue to file. So now to backtrack a little bit, I had been planning to move offshore for a long time. And I actually had acquired a place in Florida because my mom was down here and I had a couple of brothers down here. And when I knew that I wanted to live offshore, at some point, I made preparations. So all I'm doing is sharing my experience. And as you stated at the beginning of this video, this is not legal advice to anybody, but this is what I did and other people I know did, and just something to be aware of depending upon how aggressive your state is. So I made a deliberate decision around 2017 to move to Florida full-time. I got rid of my New York residences, and I followed a very specific procedure to establish my Florida residency, which I actually learned about in this book called the Florida Domicile Handbook. And I can give a link that you can put in the title that you can put at the bottom of this video. And it gives you go ahead.
And I will.
Yes. And it gives you very specific steps to follow. For instance, you're filing a declaration of domicile, and you're getting your Florida driver's license. and it's step by step by step. Register to vote, register automobiles, apply for your homestead exemption. By the way, the fellow you interviewed from Hawaii did not specifically own a home, and they tell you you don't need to in this book. It just bolsters your defense. But the gist of it is, if you're going to be moving offshore or planning to, at least that was my plan, the rule of thumb is that you have to, if you don't want to have to continue to file state returns from the state you're leaving, you need to establish residency in a different state, probably one of the 6 or 7 that doesn't collect income tax. And then you have to file returns. I've heard 2 years, but actually they state in this book, as I was brushing up on it prior to our talk, 3 years of residency. That because if you file an income tax return, as long as you filed a return, there's a 3-year statute of limitations, so long as it's not fraudulent and so long as it's not challenged by the state. So the idea is that you will have moved from your high tax state into your lower tax or no tax state, and you will file either a final return with your high tax state, and then, or else if you still have income coming from there, which I do, you then file non-resident returns each year. And if those returns go through for 3 years unchallenged, then the statute of limitations has passed on your initial return, and you are establishing yourself as a resident in your new state and not being challenged by your old state. So again, this is simply, for me now, it's been 6 or 7 or more years, so it's been a while, but it's important to check with your legal professional and to see exactly what you need to do if you want to establish a new residency. And I did it planning to go offshore. And of course, I still spend a lot of time offshore, as Dan knows, since we've communicated about that, but I haven't fully moved offshore at this point, after COVID kind of threw a monkey wrench into that plan. And at some point I will, but at the moment I'm still just going offshore for months at a time.
If you would like to learn how I fired my boss and traveled the world for 16 years and how I pay for things, grab a free copy of my ebook. That's great. Wow, that's very helpful. And so the book you showed us, and we'll put a link to below, as you mentioned, is that on Amazon? Is that right?
Yes, you can get it on Amazon. It's the edition that I currently have is the 4th edition, because I keep giving away my books to friends who move here. And then when I order the new one, it's a later edition. And they correct typos and continue to buttress their information in the book. And it's called The Florida Domicile Handbook. And it's written by E. Michael Kilborn, who has a whole alphabet soup of qualifications after his name, and Brad A. Galbraith, who's a lawyer and a CPA. And my business partner actually preceded my move to Florida, and he was the one that discovered this book, and then he turned me onto it. And I've gone through it with my accountant and with numerous other legal professionals, and this is the Bible of how to move to Florida. Now, it's probably helpful if you're going to one of the other no income tax states and you can't find a guide that gives you the level of detail that you can find in this book. But this is specific to Florida and talks about the specific steps, and then gives you a great deal of other information about Florida, and a lot of interesting information in there, and things that will be very helpful to somebody who wants to become a Florida resident. And it probably would be helpful if you wanted to move to another state to get away from a high income tax state. But it sounds like Hawaii is a whole lot mellower about this than either New York or California, which is where we hear most of the nightmare scenarios come from.
Really, it's worth, can you imagine, if you ended up with a situation where you had back year's taxes and penalties, how much money you could, how little 1,000 or 2 now would look to you in 5 or 10 years if you can hire an attorney and get it figured out now. So great advice about getting advice about that. And thanks for sharing that on the book. That'll help give people more questions to ask about their specific situation. And it is important if someone's trying to, not everyone's going to try to establish a domicile in another state to reduce their state taxes, but if they are, you're going to want to do it right.
I think you've mentioned this in past videos, but in addition to being concerned about ensuring that you're properly filing returns with whoever you have to file returns with back in the States, there's also the issue about when people start establishing bank accounts and other things offshore, when you do have an offshore life. And it's very important to ensure that if you're going to remain a U.S. citizen, there's filing requirements for once you have $10,000 offshore that you have to file every year with the Treasury Department as well as the IRS. And the penalties for failing to do that are pretty horrendous. For every account that if you have over $10,000 offshore, for every account that you fail to properly report, I believe it's a $10,000 penalty. So there are people who've been living offshore for years and they say, well, I've got my bank account here and wherever it happens to be it the Philippines, Thailand, or Malaysia, whatever. And they've never bothered me before. Yeah, but if they stumble across it, and more the way things are getting computerized these days. So I bring that up only because it's very important to have proper professional advice and good tax guidance if one is going to live offshore as a U.S. citizen, just to ensure that you don't have any unpleasant surprises at some point in the future.
Yeah, great point. And that's not only do they have that set up now, but now there's a new international law where countries are reporting on each other when their citizens are in their countries that are opening bank accounts. And I don't know that much about the law, but now the information is starting to be gathered about it. So it is a valid fear, and it is a lot of money. And so if you're, if you have an accountant, my accountant sends me out a questionnaire every year, and it's just a standard questionnaire. They ask this question. And since I don't have a foreign account, I bank in the U.S., as I explain in my international banking report. I don't have to file those reporting, but a lot of people decide to file or open foreign bank accounts. So it's important information. Thanks for sharing that. And
well, you're a gypsy. You're a gypsy. You don't spend. That's what you need next is that covered wagon that you just take from place to place.
Yeah, exactly. It's if this were 100 years ago, I would have a covered wagon and I'd be rolling it everywhere. But and I do actually cross a lot of borders on land in buses and trains and whatnot because it's cheaper than flying. And I often, as you know, I explore a certain part of the world completely before I jump on a jet and I fly somewhere else. And so I'm not on these international flights all the time. I'm more on the ground. Some places you have to fly to, Philippines, if you're flying to another continent and that sort of thing. But mostly I try to stay on the ground. So a covered wagon would be fine for most of it. But unfortunately, it's only one check bag and one carry-on nowadays. So
yeah. Well, I tend to stay put more in one place or at least one country for a while. So I have been careful when I have accounts like that. And I know you differ from me. I recently got a Philippine retirement visa, and just doing that means you have to leave $10,000 behind in the country. So bingo, you're going to be reporting that even if you don't have any other international accounts.
Exactly. Yeah, and it's. Yeah, so another great share. You also mentioned earlier that that there's some AARP insurance available now. What is it? That was unfamiliar to me. What is it that you'd like to share about that?
Well, one of the things that comes up, of course, especially when you talk to some of the more mature members that you're interviewing who happen to be on Medicare, such as I am, there are different supplemental policies. And the one that I have and a couple of my pals have is the AARP United Healthcare policy. And it's not the HMO one that they have all the doctors participating. It's more of the straight insurance type policy. And that particular policy, I was surprised to learn after the fact, gives you $50,000 of offshore coverage. And it's a lifetime coverage. It's not per year, but it's $50,000 of coverage so that if you have a major health event where you happen to be someplace else in the world, if you save the bills, you can get reimbursed from the policy, even if you're offshore. It's not the type of coverage where they would fly you home for treatment is a completely different thing. But this gives you coverage. So, for instance, I just ran into a little heart thing, and when I was I was returning from Thailand. And had it happened in Thailand, and had I had a hospital procedure in Thailand, I would have had $50,000 of coverage. I'd have to pay for it while I was there, but I could later get reimbursed for the treatment that I received. So if you have viewers or members who are on Medicare, I highly recommend that they check out the AARP United Healthcare supplemental policy. And by the way, there may be other policies that do this as well, but we've all been recommended to this one for the quality of the coverage that we get back in the States. So if you're happy with what you have, just find out if they have offshore coverage. And if they don't, you might, if you're going to be spending a lot of time offshore and possibly have a health issue, you might want to look into the AARP United Healthcare policy.
And I think you said that was supplement F as in Frank. Is that right?
Yes. It's supplement F as in Frank.
Okay. And now, again, this is another thing where we're raising an issue, but you need to contact the insurer and verify what states it covers, if all states, and also, Jeff, you mentioned to me that you pay up front and then you submit the bills and they pay you back. So you need to have a little bit of savings to take advantage of that full 50K. But that's a big deal because offshore, 50K is a lot of money. In the US, you might eat that up in a week or two in an emergency room, or less maybe. But I have lots of stories where people have had complete treatments for various things, heart disease, cancer, by going to one of these medical tourism countries that have, good experiences that you can learn about online. And the whole bill was less than 50. Whereas they flew back home, the bill might be quite a bit more. And so 50 is quite a bit of money overseas, even though maybe it's not, in the US.
Well, I was in the Philippines for a month at the end of 2022. And then I was in Thailand for a few months in 2023. And in both places, I wound up I had a tooth problem, and then I had an eye problem. And I went to a top shelf eye hospital in the Philippines, and they put me through a very rigorous exam and spent a whole lot of time with me. And the bill was like $250. When I got out, I was shocked. And then I've been going to either Bangkok Hospital or Bumrungrad when I'm in Thailand. And Bumrungrad has got to be one of the top hospitals in the world. And I actually had a tooth extraction and an implant done, which they did at exactly the same time, which kind of surprised me. I went in for an exam and they said, "Oh, you need an extraction and an implant." And I said, "All right, when do you want to do it?" He said, "How about now?" And I'm like, "What?" So anyway, they'd actually had a couple other people look at the tooth earlier in the day, and they waited for the specialists that evening. So it wasn't quite that abrupt, but it was close. And I hadn't gotten around to eating dinner, and this was around 6 p.m. So I thought I was going to be able to have some soup or something afterwards. That was the night when I went to bed without supper. But anyway, the whole thing was a third of what it would have cost me back in the States. And the care is just amazing. And you walk in a Bumrungrad hospital, you feel like you're in a 5-star hotel, and if you've been there before, they've got some restaurants there, and They've got almost anything that you need, and the front desk staff is just incredible, and the equipment's incredible. And most of their physicians have trained at the top U.S. Facilities and are board certified. So it's not like you're giving up anything to get care there. And it really is fractions of what it would cost back here in the U.S. In fact, a pal of mine had arthroscopic knee surgery, and I think he spent 2 or 3 days in the hospital. And I'm sure it was just a few $1,000s for the whole thing, which, back in the States, forget it. So it's not an unreasonable thing to think about having your care offshore. And if you do have some reserves that you can pay for it up front, and you're going to be covered from your AARP United, so you're not going to lose anything. But then again, you're covered with Medicare and AARP United back in the States, and there's nothing out of pocket. So that's a good policy as well.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, so it's nice. It's comforting to know, though, that if you're somewhere and you don't want to jump on a plane to go back to the U.S. for care, but you have a little money in the bank to pay for it up front, you don't have to do that. You can do quicker surgeries and procedures. And I have a similar story. I was in when I first left the U.S. it was for working, and I was in New Delhi, India, and I suddenly had I had a hard time breathing, and I went to the hospital, and it took them like a full day, maybe a day and a half, to find out what was wrong with me. And I was in the hospital. Memory serves me, it was 5 days. And they did CAT scans and MRIs, and I had 3 doctors working on my case. I had a private room with a couch in it, so my girlfriend could stay there with me. And they not only had great food at the hospital, but they had menus from restaurants where they would deliver food. So whatever we felt like eating was there, and it was just one-on-one talks with doctors that might last 15, 20 minutes. Whereas in the U.S., they would be in and out of your room in 15 to seconds, or maybe 3 to 5 minutes if you're lucky. And the whole thing, 5 days, including all of the medicine, all of the hospital, the doctors, everything was $1,600. Now that's a decade ago. Maybe it's double that now. Maybe it's 3,000 or whatever. But at the time I was working, and my deductible was $200. So that people don't realize that, and that was the finest hospital in New Delhi, India, which is, may not know it, but it's one of the, India has a lot of very smart people that do research and are on top of their field, and that is the number one hospital there that I was at. So it's not always more is better, and that's what I found to be the case too. But you just have to do a little research, ask around, and make sure you're going to the right place. And I've had the same stories that you have, so. Wow, great. Thanks so much for sharing. Appreciate it.
Yeah, well, that's great. And especially, if people do a little bit of planning, and clearly most of the people that you interview have done a lot of planning and really looked into things. But just to be able to share this information with them to make their choices a little bit easier, I'm happy to be able to pass along what I've collected in my own research.
Yeah, and I confirm the hospital that you're referring to in Thailand is where, if I'm in Southeast Asia, I go every year for my physical, and they do way more testing and stuff than they would in the U.S., and it's way cheaper. So it's a lovely hospital, like you said.
Bumrungrad, or
Bumrungrad, yeah. And then I also get my dental.
Bangkok Hospital is nice too, but anyway, go ahead.
Yeah, and I get my dental done there too. And I had 2 failed surgeries in the U.S. on a tooth. And then when I was in Thailand, it flared up again, and I had it done. Now that's 6 or 7 years ago. It hasn't flared up. So maybe the quality can even be better. We think this idea that the world is, chaos and it's all safe and comfy, and cheap. It's just not really true. So nice.
Well, there's another place in Bangkok, by the way, called the Bangkok International Dental Center.
Yeah, that's the one. That's the one.
That is unbelievable. I had a crown done there. They're great. I have friends that went there and had whole mouths full of implants and veneers and all kinds of things done there. Yeah. And it's a fraction of what it costs back in the States. And the quality of care is exceptional, absolutely exceptional.
Yeah, it's clean and beautiful and safe, and I just can't speak more highly of the people really need to think through this preconceived notions they have about it. It's,
Yeah.
you know, it takes a little research to make sure that you're, going to the right spot. You can ask other expats depending what country you're in. But almost all of these retired chief countries will have one or two or three hospitals that are on par with the U.S. quality-wise, but their prices are way, way lower. And so that's something worth it.
Yeah, well, I did not expect to find the same level of care in Manila as I found in Bangkok. And I was going to wait to get to Bangkok when I had this eye. I was getting these floaters in my vision. And that's when I went to this eye hospital, which was a top eye hospital. So I'm sure you can do fine in Manila. I'm just more familiar with the medical facilities in Bangkok at this point. But when you're in these different parts of the world, I mean, they do medical tourism here, and they're not going to be doing medical tourism and providing crappy care, or they're not going to be doing medical tourism for long.
Exactly. Well, Jeff, it's been a real joy chatting with you, and I really appreciate you come on and share some very important things. And thank you, and I'm sure my audience thanks you so much. And come back later and say hi to everyone and tell us something more you've learned. How's that?
It's my pleasure, and thank you for all of the information that you provide, which was my inspiration during COVID. And I'm trying to catch up with you at some point in another part of the world sooner or later, but we keep being in the same places at different times. So eventually we'll be able to share a beer.
Yeah, ships passing in the night. But yeah, let's do that, Jeff. Thanks so much.
Definitely. Yeah, you have a great day, Dan. Take care.
You too. See you later.
Bye-bye.
Click the link in the notes below this video for Google Map links, reports, and other information. There you will also see our Retire Cheap in Paradise catalog, how we pay for our travels, and my free ebook, How I Fired My Boss and Traveled the World for 14+ years.